Whatever your plant interests, orchids will almost inevitably drift into your consciousness sooner or later. The Mediterranean island of Crete has much to offer the alpine plant enthusiast, but this coffee time talk I want to give a quick introduction to the richness of the orchid flora that can be found in the surrounds of the higher mountains. It will be a rapid tour around the island with samples from about 10 different locations, but it should give you a feel for the breadth of interest even from this one plant family. Orchids are a challenge. Their beauty is undeniable, but they're hard to get to know. The indications are that they're among the oldest of the plant families, having started to evolve in the late Cretaceous period some 76 to 105 million years ago. They're also one of the largest plant families and one of the most diverse. But it's not just the volume of genera and species that one has to get to grips with, it's also the extent of variation within individual species. It seems almost everyone you meet has a different and strongly held opinion on what constitutes a new local species or simply a sample of the variation of a more geographically widespread species. Over the last 40 years or so, I've seen, for example, different authorities' judgments of the number of species of Ophrys, the bee orchids, vary from around 350 down to 35. So what I've done in this lecture is do my best to use the relatively recent field guide by Kuhn, Pedersen and Cribb as my authority. This lovely book on the right-hand side illustrates the extent of variation within individual species and subspecies, with clear statements of those features that are stable across populations and can be used to distinguish between taxa. The beautiful book with text by Hendrik Pedersen and illustrations by Bo Mosberg on the left-hand side clearly explains the classification approach taken. At the time of writing, this is available for the ridiculously low price of £7.50 from Amazon, so there's no reason not to buy it. Crete is the largest of a series of islands that are relics of a former mountain chain that swung round from the Peloponnese to Turkey. Let's travel across the island from east to west. This works quite well as the weather warms up and stabilises during the first 2 weeks of April. The eastern part of the island is generally the drier and best visited first. The windmills of the Lassithi Plateau feature in many postcards, but are little more than ornaments nowadays. The plateau itself and its surrounding hills still have a rich balance between natural history and cultivation. Along and inland from the coast to the east of Agios Nikolaos, the Frejana and more woodied Maki are good habitats for orchids. If you travel to the area around Toplu Monastery, the shrubby Maki will reward with some good finds, including sites of the native palm Phoenix theophrastri. The south side of the island is generally less populated, apart from around Rapetra, of course, and has some wonderful natural habitats. So these are all good areas to focus on. Sadly, many of the archaeological sites on Greece are now sprayed with herbicides, but the ruins of the Minoan town of Gornia are not as intensively visited, and there is much of interest here, both botanically and historically. Orchids aren't the only thing, so I can't help mentioning one or two other notable plants. Although widespread through the Mediterranean, Gladiolus italicus is always a joy to behold. But to orchids we must go. The tongue orchids, Serapias, like bee orchids, show so much variability that can lead to a range of species and subspecies names being proposed. This first one is Serapias parviflora. As mentioned, I have used the field guide by Kuhn, Pedersen and Cribb as my reference, but any errors in identification are mine, of course, and not the field guides. One of the most significant recent changes in orchid taxonomy has been the move of a number of Orchis species into the formerly monotypic genus Anacamptis. This was primarily on the basis of DNA studies, although there has been some distinguishing morphological features. So this plant becomes Anacamptis, not Orchis, collina. Note for later the absence of any spots on the lip. Moving inland, the habitat transitions into maquis with more shrubs and tree cover. It was not possible to resist putting in a picture of the Cretan peony, Peonia clusii, as it's such a beautiful plant. Sadly, it's a little on the tender side for growing out of doors in the UK. Abandoned terraces, or just around the edges of terraces, are good places to look for orchids. And here we find our first bee orchid, the bumblebee orchid, Orchis bombiliflora. This one is quite easy to recognise, although harder to spot, with its green flowers and very dark speculum, the speculum being the main pattern area on the lip. The woodcock orchid is a taller plant generally, although when looking at close-ups it is useful to have a reminder that none of the bee orchids are particularly large plants. This one is about 30 centimetres tall. The Orchis bombiliflora I just showed you is typically about half that. The woodcock orchids, Orchis scolopax, is quite widespread around the Mediterranean, with 9 subspecies recognised by Kuhn, Pedersen and Cribb. This one, subspecies Heldreichii, is native to Greece and differs from the nominate form by a slightly larger lip and larger basal appendage. That's the little yellow bit at the tip of the lip. So this makes it Orchis scolopax subspecies Heldreichii. Probably the most frequent one you would find in Crete. Orchis omegifera is quite distinct, with the mark across the speculum like the lowercase Greek character omega. The lip is a bit similar in shape to that of the dingy bee orchid, Orchis fusca, but note here that the base of the lip, that's the bit nearest the column, is quite smooth, whilst that of Orchis fusca is deeply furrowed. See a bit here, you'll see it a bit clearer on the close-ups, deeply furrowed at the base. Actually, this one is subspecies iricolor and not so dingy, with its iridescent blue speculum. The blue of the speculum showing up best, of course, as it catches the sunlight. Orchis fusca, subspecies iricolor. You'll find, of course, Orchis fusca itself on Crete quite widely. The Lysithi plateau is known from geography lessons as a polier. That's a plateau formed from the dissolution of limestone from the surrounding mountains. As such, it makes a wonderful spot for wildflowers before the heat of the sun builds up too much. The milky orchid looks like it should also be an orchis, but it is one of 4 species of Neotinia, Neotinia lactea. But firmly within orchis, at least for the moment, is Orchis pauciflora, the sparse-flowered orchid. The contrast between the pale petals and sepals and the stronger yellow lip help to distinguish it from the other yellow-flowered orchids. Oh, and there are butterflies. Watch out for these too. This is the scarce swallowtail. Not so scarce in Greece and Crete, so the common name is a bit too Anglo-centric. I find it very confusing to watch it because rightly, the eye spots on the tail tend to look like eyes, and it always, when you get first glance of it, looks like it's flying backwards. Back down to the coast, the often spiny and aromatic shrubs of the Fragana offer some protection to smaller and more vulnerable plants, including the succulent orchids. You might find late spider orchid here, Orchis fuciflora. Kuhn, Pedersen and Cribb distinguish 15 subspecies, mostly associated with specific geographic regions, but as far as I can tell, this one is the widespread nominate species. The Fragana continues up inland for some wonderfully floristic landscapes. Orchis sitiaca is afforded some protection from grazing by the spiny bonnet, Sarcopaterium spinosum. Notice the silvery grey leaves that help to distinguish it from Orchis anatolica, which we will see later. More showy still is the pink butterfly orchid. Indeed, it's hard to miss when flowering en masse as here. Another of those that has been moved from Orchis, it is now Anacamptis papilionacea. Let's move on to central Crete, an area dominated by the Grand Mountains of Salaritis. The Palace of Festos does not have the controversial reconstruction of Knossos. It is well worth visiting, but of course try to get there early before all the coach parties. More interesting from a botanical perspective is what you might call an orchid bank a little further up the road. As well as that, if you continue along the valleys at the in the foothills of Salaritis, you'll find some very rich areas for studying orchids. You'll see here the range of maquis and fragana and a relatively low level of cultivation. Starting back at Festos, explore that a little, but travel a bit further up the road, and there's this little orchid bank which is up just past a small chapel and on the right hand side. Pass through there and you'll see here early spider orchid, again illustrating that common names are not necessarily indicative of the true character of a plant. Early spider orchid is just as likely to be in flower here at the same time as late spider orchid, as we've seen. This one is subspecies Mimosa for the very obvious reasons. Note also the bicoloured lateral sepals of this subspecies. The speculum may be H-shaped as here or consists just of two parallel lines. More familiar orchid to many is Anacamptis pyramidalis, the pyramidal orchid. The pyramidal shape is only really apparent in the early stages of the inflorescence opening, with a more cylindrical shape here being characteristic of the later stages. I've not yet mentioned the widespread yellow bee orchid, Ophrys lutea. Like Ophrys bombiliflora, it's a modest little plant, but it's a bit easier to spot as it seems to be a more social plant and can be found in quite large colonies, especially in short grass where there is little competition. Serapias again prove to be more architectural plants. Lots of discussions about points of variation, and both Serapias vomeracea and Serapias orientalis are present on Crete. Always better to identify the plant in the field rather than post hoc from a photo, but the field guide I'm using hadn't been written then, so put a bit of a question mark on my identification. Talking of bee orchids en masse, here we have the endemic Ophrys cretica, actually found from the southern mainland through Aegean Islands to Crete. It is intensely variable in the wild. Some authors have divided it into 4 or 5 subspecies, but it's hard to delimit the points of variation. Note especially the variability in the size and shape of the side lobes and the patterning on the speculum. These are just 2 examples. There are many, many more. See the book. The valleys to the south of Salaritis are lightly cultivated and well worth exploring in detail, as I said. Serapias lingua is probably the most widespread of the tongue orchids, supporting its epithet of common tongue orchid. The lighter colouring of the lip also helps to distinguish it. Orchis italica is also pretty widespread and seemingly deserving of the popular name of naked man orchid. Finally, for this part of the island, we have Orchis anatolica. This is more widespread than the endemic Orchis citiaca that I mentioned before. This plant, Orchis anatolica, has green rather than silvery grey leaves. Note also the bicoloured lateral sepals, which also help to distinguish it. Now we go across to the north side of the island and travel west to the White Mountains. This will be a relatively quick visit, as I only want to show one or two new orchids. You'll see, of course, many of the ones we've already seen if you travel around here. We'll mainly focus on and around the Omelos Plateau, but the now inland Hellenic harbour of Falasana is well worth a visit. And if you go down to the coast from there, you may well find the rare and threatened Tulipa golemyi. The surroundings of the White Mountains are noticeably more tree-covered and moister than the east and central parts of Crete. Orchis simia can be found on drier areas, but Anacamptis laxiflora is more a plant of wet flushes and damp meadows. And finally, Anacamptis boreae is kind of a bit in-betweeny in its preferences. Notice the broad fan-shaped lip of the Anacamptis boreae with just a few spots at the base of the lip. We're just about done on this lightning tour of the orchids of Crete, but mountains are the thing, and I can't resist a quick walk up from the Omelos Plateau to the mountain refuge that looks out over the gorge of Samaria. Just before you get to the refuge, there is a small polyp that is a truly wonderful sight to behold. It's carpeted by mid-April with Crocus seberi subspecies seberi. First described in 1831 by the French botanist Jacques Gay from plants collected in Crete by the Czech naturalist Franz Sieber. The various subspecies of Crocus seberi can be found quite widely throughout the Balkans. Subspecies tricolor is available from nurseries, for example, and makes a lovely plant for troughs or the rock garden. Well, there we have it. It's been a joy preparing this coffee time talk through one of the most wintry marches we've had in the UK for a long time. If you travel to Crete in early April, you should easily see all the orchids I've shown you and more. Just studying the orchids should keep you occupied for a couple of weeks, but there is much more to see, so find the time to do that. In addition, if you stay in smaller hotels and eat in local taverns, you will experience genuine kindness and hospitality, and you may end up thinking that Crete is the best place to be. Thank you.